Be merciful, as God is merciful. 24th Sunday in Ordinary Time. According to today's first reading from Sirach, wrath and anger are hateful things. This is followed by a teaching against vengeance. We are not to be vengeful. We are not to nourish and encourage the growth of anger and wrath against a brother or a sister, but rather we are to let go of our anger and be merciful and forgiving. Psalm 103 then tells us why we are commanded not to be vengeful, why we are commanded not to willfully resend anger and memories associated with this anger through our hearts and minds. We are to be merciful and patient because the Lord is kind and merciful, slow to anger, and rich in compassion, and we are made in God's image and likeness. Therefore, logically, since we are made in God's image and likeness, we should strive to allow God's image and likeness to shine through us from the depths of our heart outward, in particular His merciful love, so that we can become windows into heaven, become icons of God's merciful love. Jesus, in today's gospel passage, teaches us through a story, through a parable, what the selections from Sirach and Psalm 103 teach us. By focusing on one word from today's gospel passage in its original Greek, Brant Petrie helps us to understand this parable. Today's English translation says that the servant who was forgiven by his master owed a huge amount. The original Greek specifies what this huge amount was. According to the Greek, it was 10,000 talents, so the word is talents. At the time of Jesus, 1 talent was equivalent to 6,000 denarii, and 1 denarius was what an average worker received for 1 day of work. This means that the worker owed his master 160,000 denarii, which if he worked off the debt and gave his entire daily wage to his master, would mean that the worker would have to work 160,000 years to pay off the debt he owed his master. In contrast, a fellow servant of the worker only owed a smaller amount, or in the original Greek, only 100 denarii, which was equivalent to 100 days of wages. And yet the worker refused to be merciful to his brother servant, which is awful, especially since their master had forgiven the worker of a debt worth at least 160,000 years of wages. Not surprisingly, the master's response to his ungrateful and unmerciful servant is to change his mind by handing this worker, and I quote, over to the torturers until he should pay back the whole debt. Now, in order for him to pay back the whole debt, that would mean he would have to work 160,000 years at least, and that is impossible. The lesson on mercy contained in today's scripture passages instruct us what to do. But then we may ask ourselves, okay, now I know what to do, be merciful, but how do I become merciful? How do I forgive? Especially since forgiveness is so hard to do. And sometimes when I think I have forgiven, something will trigger a painful memory. And then I feel almost compelled, with maybe a little bit of free will, and I feel almost compelled to be resentful and vengeful, to send that anger within my spiritual arteries again and again. The key is not to rely primarily on myself and my supposed strength of will, but rather first to rely on Jesus, on His merciful grace, which gradually, always so respectful of my nature, respectful of the natural laws of growth, will help me to grow in mercy, to grow in patience, so as to be a tiny bit more like Jesus, the merciful one, the patient one, the forgiving one. Sometimes, and I think this advice might come from St. Thomas Aquinas, sometimes, if it is difficult for us to even pray specifically for someone who has hurt us deeply, we can at least take the first step in fulfilling the commandment to forgive by praying in general for all who have hurt us, including the one who has hurt us in a very deep way, with the hope that someday, as we cooperate with grace, we will not only be able to pray by name for the one who has hurt us, but even will want them to be filled with happiness, filled with joy. God bless.